All right, what's up? What's up? Wes Mitchell here, Chris Clark, GC Live, Wednesday episode of the show as we roll on towards this South Carolina versus Auburn matchup. And Chris, we're very, very, I would say, excited to be joined, man. Our guests so far as the, guys who cover other teams that have joined us, I would dare say have been fantastic because I judge that by, hey, did I learn something new? And I felt like every single person we've had that has come on to talk about South Carolina's opponent for a particular week has actually taught us something maybe that we didn't know. So today we'll have Bryan Matthews, auburnsports.com. He'll be joining us at about 2:15 Eastern time. And he'll, of course, give some Auburn perspective and sort of talk about this matchup. And then after that, Chris and I will sort of delve in maybe to some things that we learned, maybe some new things that he talked about, and some key matchups as we roll on towards this game. Again, GC Live, of course, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and all the major podcast platforms. Please hit the share buttons, hit the like buttons, and subscribe if you're on YouTube. We are, of course, brought to you by AffordableMedicalUSA.com, home of the Game Day Chair. Chris, before we get rolling, why don't you tell everybody about the Game Day Chair and how they can get hooked up with one?
Yeah, so if you're checking out games at home this year, like so many of us all are, make sure you check out the Game Day Chair. You know, you've got your fridge, you've got the comforts of your home, your AC, your heat, which you'll need soon, your beverages, your food. Add the comforts of the Game Day Chair. What is the Game Day Chair? It is the Maxi Comfort Cloud with Twilight technology. So go to AffordableMedicalUSA.com. They got a little search bar. Search for the Maxi Comfort Cloud with Twilight, power pillow, lumbar support, super roomy, super comfortable chair. I've already got several people who have inquired about it who are really interested in getting one. Had one yesterday saying that I think it was Rob, who is deployed right now, saying that he's been promised one for Christmas. So that is a pretty awesome Christmas gift. If you're on YouTube, check out the link right in the description for the Game Day Chair. You can go get more information there or on GamecockCentral.com right in the little module for GC Live. So appreciate their support. Make sure you check out those guys.
I see we already have several of our usual suspects joining us. Gamecock Russ. I don't know how to say your name. Nectarios Kapelos. I don't know. I don't know those words, but I'll do my best. Travis Edwards, who is a Gamecock Central subscriber. Craig joining us per usual. Cartwright on here. USC Insider. Ernest Miller, that's a name I recognize. Daniel Watts, a name I recognize as well. So I would say our usual suspects are in the house and looking forward to learning something from our friend Bryan Matthews. Chris, so all right, we've started to sort of turn the page into this game. I guess we're still on the site doing some coverage back at Vanderbilt, some of those deeper dives, but we've turned the page here. What would you say as we sort of get ready for Bryan? Is there anything about this Auburn team you're most looking forward to learning from Bryan as we sort of find out a little bit more from the inside of that program?
Yeah, so for me, a couple things come to mind. The first is Gus Malzahn earlier this week talked about some of the guys that they had been missing, you know, due to injury or whatever it may have been. He expected, Gus Malzahn said, for a lot of those guys to return to practice on Tuesday. So want to see if B-Matt has any insight into which guys are back or could be back. KJ Britt, obviously, their really talented linebacker, is probably still out. It looks like he had a thumb surgery. But they were missing some other guys against Arkansas that have been really important for them. Jalen Simpson, one of their corners. Wes, remember we saw him in camp. He and Jay-Sean Sheffield in camp a few years back. You know, he was one of the guys there. He's been a good player for them. Sean Shivers, another guy we saw at South Carolina's camp back in the day, really fast player. He missed the last game. They had a few guys out in terms of depth defensively. One note that I saw that Jay Tate dropped on AuburnSports.com, the publisher, he said that I think all of their guys in the secondary played every snap. You know, they didn't rotate any guys. I think they played 77 defensive snaps in the game. They're expected to get some more depth back. So for me, the question of availability, getting some guys back, and then just diving into some of the individual matchups. What are the strengths of this Auburn team? What are some of the weaknesses? I think we know some of the strengths are the skill position guys, right? Tank Bigsby at running back, Shivers if he's available, Anthony Schwartz, maybe the fastest player in the country. But are there some other strengths that maybe we're not talking about, and what are the areas in which they've struggled? Those are the things that I think we can watch the games a little bit surface level, but just diving in deeper with somebody that sees them all the time.
I've sort of always been a little intrigued by Gus Malzahn and the perception of him as an offensive mind, the perception of him as a head coach, and of his offenses. I feel like Malzahn came into this league as sort of the offensive guru. You even heard some people genius gets thrown around, and when he's had the right people, his offense has been very difficult to stop. I feel like. Now, obviously, you and I don't watch Auburn every week. I generally am only watching Auburn, A, if they're playing a big-time matchup, or B, and South Carolina obviously hasn't played them since 2014, so there was no real, hey, I need to watch this team to get ready for a Carolina game, something like that. So, to me, Malzahn in this offense, from year to year, there's been like a very high level of variance where it's like some years they're really, really good offensively, and then some years my perception is that they're pretty bad offensively. I kind of my perception is that Gus is a good football coach. Now, you start reading, I was reading on auburnsports.com, looking at what some of their fans were saying, Chris, and there's a lot of people over there who really would like to see Gus gone, and see somebody else there. And, this is a guy that has won the national title as their OC, and taken you to the national title as a head coach,
right? Against Jameis Winston and FSU, was that the one? I believe that was it. Yeah,
and has, I would say, man, has done as good of a job as anybody has against Nick Saban. If you just look at how Auburn has matched up with Alabama compared to how everybody else in the league has matched up. So I think Gus is a good coach. The perception I get from now, is that just fringe people? Is that the way their entire fan base feels? Sometimes you're just ready for a change. I feel like if a coach is at a place for long enough, eventually a lot of people sort of just turn on them. I mean, you can go to Alabama's website and people, are complaining about Alabama's defense against Ole Miss. And yes, it was a struggle, but I mean, how many national titles has Nick Saban brought Alabama? So it's interesting to me they're the perception of Gus Malzahn. And I don't know how you feel, Chris, as far as where is Gus Malzahn for you as far as how good of a head coach is he?
So the interesting thing about Gus is it's a little bit like the thing with the crazy Auburn games that we talked about yesterday. Like every year there's all right, Gus is on the hot seat and then he has a good year. And then it's like Gus is on the hot seat, and there are so many ebbs and flows. And you're right. I think people, because that national title game was in his first year, right? That was in his first year as a head coach. They tied for first in the West. They went 12-1 in the regular season. They end up losing in the national title game. Very close game. Then he's 8-5, 7-6, 8-5, 10-4. He's won the West, or he's tied for the West divisional crown one other time. 2015 was obviously not a great year, 7-6, 2-6 in conference. But the last 3 years he's been 10-4, 8-5, 9-4. And so with a program like Auburn, with that amount of tradition, you are going to get to a point when a guy's been there a while. Just like you said, people are naturally going to say, let's try something else. I mean, I sort of understand it, right? Even if you're, I guess, there, people want a little bit more at times. And in the SEC, where every week's a season, we've seen that at the school we cover, we see that at a bunch of other schools. Saw it at Tennessee last year. Everybody wanted to run Jeremy Pruitt off. Then they reel off a bunch of straight games. Now everybody feels great about it. So I think it ebbs and flows like that. I think Gus has done a good job. They haven't ever fallen off a cliff. They've been stable. They've turned in some really good seasons. They've turned in some big moments. You know, you think about some of the games that they've won, whether it's against Alabama, some other teams, crazy game against Georgia that year. And a lot of schools, we've seen this with Arkansas, you know, made a run at Gus, and some other schools have either made a run at Gus or he's been suggested, hey, if you're trying to pluck a coach who maybe the fit isn't there anymore, maybe you go try to pluck him because he's a guy that's actually proven some things, right? So I think it is pretty fascinating, the perception, and I think it'd be a cool thing to ask Bryan about, just to sort of get his vibe on that.
Yeah, definitely. And I sorry, I was trying to read real quick. And thanks to Kyle for alerting me there. I didn't realize Florida LSU, a little bit of breaking news here, has officially been postponed. And Brett McMurphy coming in, Chris, saying Florida has 18 current scholarship players, 3 walk-ons, and 2 assistant coaches who have all tested positive for COVID, and that Florida would have less than 50 scholarship players available for Saturday's game, which obviously is now postponed. So there you have it. Some unfortunate timing for Dan Mullen to be talking about packing the swamp, I think. And now a large portion of his team does have COVID, as we see. Really, the SEC, I would say, has been fairly lucky to this point. And now we're seeing what's happened at Vanderbilt, and then, of course, what's happening at Florida as well. And, just hope all those kids are able to, flush the virus quickly and be fine, like most kids their age are. And that this can just be something that is a minor hurdle. But a little bit of breaking news there for those teams. And we'll see when, that, Chris, potentially, I would think, I don't know who Florida has next week. The way quarantines are and contact tracing and stuff like that, that potentially puts you at risk for 2 weeks as well, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, so Missouri next, I believe, for Florida, right after, that LSU game. I think they're moving the Florida LSU game tentatively to December, I think December 12th. So, yeah, Missouri's next for Florida. And as everyone knows, or if not, just a reminder, because I had to remind myself earlier, I think it's 10 days of isolation for a positive and 14 days for a quarantine. So definitely in jeopardy of that. Now, will some guys be okay in terms of testing by then? Will they have completed 10 days based on maybe they tested the Sunday after, Monday after, the last game that Florida played? Maybe. It would appear at a minimum they're probably going to have to be down some guys at a minimum, right, for the Missouri game. But I guess we'll sort all that out and see. But, yeah, they're certainly not in a great position with that.
No doubt. So a little bit of breaking news here. Florida LSU officially postponed. And with that, we're going to go out now and bring in Bryan Matthews from auburnsports.com as we pull him up here on the stream. Bryan, first of all, can you see us? Can you hear us? And how you doing, man?
Yeah, man. Y'all sound good. I can see y'all. This is great technology. I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me.
Awesome, man. I appreciate it. We appreciate the time as always. And we don't get South Carolina and Auburn. We don't. Right. It never happens, it seems like. It's been a while. So glad to be able to catch up with you guys and sort of dive into this thing, man. So what's the vibe been like in Auburn so far this year? I know it's different for everybody. How's everything going at auburnsports.com?
Well, it's been tough on everybody, I think, just like the rest of the world, being secluded, not being able to hang out with your friends. And, I don't know about you guys, but part of the best thing about being a beat writer or a college football reporter is just being around the other reporters and hanging out and talking trash to each other and just, making fun of the coaches or whatever we do, behind the scenes. So I've really missed out on that. But from a football perspective, I'd say Auburn is, maybe not as good as fans want them to be. probably in a similar vein to South Carolina. In fact, I think you could look at the SEC and see about 6 or 7 teams, and Auburn, South Carolina are in it, in my opinion. That could be 6-4, maybe 7-3 if they catch all the breaks. Could be 5-5, 4-6, and there's gonna be one of those teams that's 3-7. I know Auburn, South Carolina don't want to be that team, so it's just one of those years we don't have those 3 or 4 non-conference games to pad your schedule with. Man, it's dog eat dog.
So, Bryan, we were talking about something right before you came on, and it was about Gus Malzahn, and we were talking about how – so this is a little bit more general, broad picture before we move into the game and those matchups. But Wes and I were discussing how the fan base has seemed, just from our view, sort of hot and cold on Gus depending on the year. And obviously there have been some ebbs and flows to the record and maybe how people think. What's the current state of mind there with the fan base towards Gus Malzahn and just the rest of the coaching staff and sort of the state of the program there?
Well, I think Gus Malzahn is a likable person, so I don't think there's a lot of people just dislike him. But he's 7-16 against Auburn's 3 biggest rivals: Alabama, Georgia, and LSU. So it's hard to really love him, when you have that record against the 3 teams that decide whether or not Auburn's competing for a championship or not every year. Has not won any of those games on the road. I think it's 2-4 or 2-5 bowl record, I think is what it is now. So from just a plain wins and loss record, he's been good for Auburn, but he hasn't been great. But you have to have the caveat that Alabama's as good as it's ever been. LSU's been pretty darn good. It's just come off one of the best seasons in college football history. And now Georgia is recruiting as good as anybody in the country. They've won 3 straight rivals recruiting team championships, what do you want to call it. So it's a much tougher place for Auburn to be in. Nobody plays a schedule like Auburn does in the SEC every season.
Bryan, so we're 3 games in. And like you said, it sort of feels like for the most part, all these SEC teams are just sort of beating up on each other. You've got close games, a big play here, a big play there, or a mistake here, a mistake there, is a lot of times the determining factor in a lot of these games. So, I'm looking through Auburn, obviously a 29-13 win against Kentucky, struggled to do much offensively against, I think, a really good Georgia defense. And then obviously a very weird game last week with them holding on, hitting the big field goal against Arkansas. So I guess the question is this Auburn team remotely what you thought that, like I said, like I was telling Chris, we don't, because South Carolina doesn't play Auburn, I don't think we have a great feel for even what the expectations were for this Auburn team coming in. Is what you've seen close to what you expected so far, or far off, or is it really hard to say just 3 games in?
I'd say it's a little bit below expectations, my expectations. I felt alone that 2021 was a year that Auburn could be really good because they'll have a bunch of these guys back and they'll be mature. And, Auburn's not a team that can reload every year. They sort of got to get good players and then let them develop. And eventually, year 3 or 4, they're pretty good. But I think the reason to me they've underachieved is because I didn't expect them to be so bad at the line of scrimmage. I knew that losing Derek Brown and Marlon Davidson on the defensive line would be a hit. But Rodney Garner has done this for 30 years, and he's reloaded every year. And for whatever reason, the college guys have brought in have not worked out there. They're playing a couple of true freshmen at defensive tackle, a redshirt freshman, a true freshman. They're a little bit undersized, so they get pushed around a little bit. Those guys are going to be really good players by this time next year, but they're going to take their lumps this year. And then on the other side of the ball, I knew Auburn's offensive line was going to be a struggle. I didn't think it'd be quite this bad, and they've been sort of bad, especially at the tackle position. Solid at the guard position, but struggling at tackle and struggling a little bit at center too, even with returning starter there. So expectation-wise, maybe a little bit worse than I thought, but not too far off.
Up front on that offensive line, I know Gus Malzahn has talked about some of the guys that were potentially going to be returning to practice this week. So Austin Troxell is supposed to be back, right? How does that change the equation at tackle? Where will he slide in? Whose spot will he take? And can that significantly improve their play up front?
It could improve it. I don't know about significant. I think he was sliding at left tackle, although he's played some right tackle too. So one of those 2 spots. He was going to start last week. He got hurt during practice, I think on a Wednesday, Gus said. So that backed him up a little bit. But if you watch the Georgia game, any team that has a good pass rusher or two good pass rushers are going to give Auburn problems. Even if Austin Troxell is good, you can just flip the guy over the other side. And, Broderius Ham, the right tackle, is a really good run blocker. He should be playing guard. He may be an NFL guard in the future, but he is not a tackle. He cannot block these fast edge guys, at least from what I've seen so far. So I think that's a big area to watch in this game, is that pass rush, how effective it is for South Carolina, and what Auburn does to try to protect those guys, whether it's keeping a tight end there, whether it's doing something, real quick to sort of avert that pass rush. I think that'll be a big part of the game to watch on that side of the ball.
Bryan, Gamecock fans are very familiar with Tank Bigsby, a guy that everybody here followed very closely in the recruiting process, and obviously Auburn winning that battle in the end. He's played a lot. It seems what I've seen of Auburn. What's sort of been the evaluation of him so far? I know Auburn's been dealing with the O-line trouble, but I mean, it looks like Tank has sort of just hit the ground running and has sparked the offense, I guess, at times.
He's become Auburn's best offensive player, or close to it. He had 146 yards against Arkansas, 268 all-purpose yards, which was a freshman record in just his third game. So I think as a true freshman, he's sort of taken that position now, and it's his, and he's going to be a weapon for Auburn on offense. Not saying he's perfect yet, but what I like about him is he will break tackles and get yards after contact, which with Auburn's offensive line, you really need a guy that can do that effectively, and he's really good at it. He runs through people with his thighs, which is a really interesting thing to see a true freshman do that. It's just not what you expect. So he's pretty powerful, but you can see he's still got some growth in him, and he's going to be a much better player as a sophomore and junior. But he is a good, talented young back, one of the better players Auburn's signed over the last few years.
Bryan, when you look at the overall health, we talked about the tackle situation, the offensive line situation. How's Auburn's health, as far as we know, in this crazy year, going into this game at the other spots with, Shivers and some of the guys that they had out last week in the secondary who could potentially play roles? Are there any significant guys that are out or coming back?
Yeah, Shivers was a starting tailback. I think he's back this week, if not next week. But, he's like a 5'8", quick guy, fast guy. I don't think he's a starter anymore. So I'm not sure that makes a big impact either way. Helping out in the passing game, maybe. Auburn will be without KJ Britt for at least another month. I think he had thumb surgery. He's Auburn's big inside linebacker, first team All-SEC guy. He's that run stopper inside. So they're playing Owen Popo and Jacob McClain. Two of those, I would call them, almost Will Muschamp type linebackers. Maybe a little bit undersized, really quick and fast, tough kids, but not the best guys to stick their nose up in there and take on a 225-pound back in the hole there. So we'll see how effective that is. They've been real thin in the secondary. Their two safeties and two cornerbacks had to play all 77 snaps against Arkansas, but it looks like they're getting back Jalen Simpson, who started at cornerback week 1, was SEC Freshman of the Week, really good young player, and they may get Jordan Peters as backup safety, so they may be a little bit better off back there, but I think injury-wise, they're better this week. Big Cat Bryant should be back. He's the All-SEC defensive lineman, although I've never considered him to be an impact-type player, just a guy with a lot of experience as a senior. So they're better off, not 100%, but definitely better than they were a week ago.
Sounds kind of like what South Carolina has dealt with, at least in the secondary a couple of years ago. I mean, just not ideal when those guys have to play so many snaps. Yep. So at least I think from a depth standpoint for Auburn, getting some guys back in the secondary would have to be welcome, for those guys on that side of the ball. So, Bryan, I don't know how much you've had a chance to dive into sort of South Carolina or not, but what are a couple of matchups going into this game? And you can take it as deep or as broad as you would like. Are there some matchups, that you sort of already have maybe circled and said Auburn has to win this battle or Auburn can't lose this battle as far as this game goes?
Well, I think when you look at South Carolina's offense, I think they've got a quarterback who can sling it pretty good. They've got a really good running back, one of the better ones in the SEC, and they got a receiver that can make some plays. So that brings some balance to their attack, in my opinion. And you look at Auburn, they can take maybe one thing away, but in order to do that, they've got to take chances elsewhere. They can't rush the passer with just 4 guys. They just don't have that premier pass rusher, that edge guy they've had, a few years ago. They haven't really had one the last couple of years. So that means if they want to pressure quarterback, they're going to have to bring a fifth guy or a sixth guy. And their nickel, Christian Tutt, is a pretty good player, but he is not great in man coverage. He's been picked on a lot. He's been targeted a lot. And I think that's something you'll probably see South Carolina do a lot of. So on that side of the ball, I think the biggest concern is South Carolina being able to do a lot of different things. And if they can establish a run, which they probably can, then being able to play action and make some big plays against Auburn, I think that's a possibility for South Carolina on that side of the ball. Defensively, I don't know a lot about South Carolina. I think they may have lost maybe their best pass rusher. Is that right?
Yeah, their best guy in the middle, certainly. Ken Law, probably their best defensive lineman last year. Yeah,
that probably hurts them a little bit, but Auburn's offensive line is not going to, blow anybody off the ball. At the best they can hope for is, a stalemate, so to speak. And if South Carolina has some guys that come off the edge, that are good, they're going to cause Auburn a lot of problems. So I'm sure Auburn's going to try to find a way to, do something different against Arkansas. They put the tight end out wide to try to, depopulate the box and give Tank some running room. They'll probably try to do some different things against South Carolina. I don't know how they'll scheme it up, but I think their plan is going to be to find a way to get that ball to Tank now and then open things up from there.
Bryan, I looked back at one of Auburn's games earlier this year against Kentucky because, Kentucky's thought of as a team that has pretty good defense, a team that can run the ball. They got a mobile quarterback, which South Carolina won't feature this week, but thought it was an interesting game with the scoreline, Auburn winning, I think 29-13. Some of Kentucky's stats you would think in the game would have led to a closer game. What was the recipe for success for Auburn in that game that could, carry over to a game like this? Was it just turnover margin mainly? Was that the big thing in that game, or what are some of the trends?
Kentucky had 3 turnovers.
Yeah,
which really killed them in the second half. I mean, just destroyed their ability to come back there or to sort of punch back when Auburn was scoring there. I would say that Auburn's been fortunate. The turnovers, Arkansas, everybody's seen that play at the end of the game, right? That should have been a fumble, but the rest of the whistle, and there's nothing they can really do after that. But then, you also look at that game. Auburn first touchdown was on a block punt for a touchdown, and there was a time from the end of the second half through that final drive that Arkansas had where they scored every time except for the one where they got the ball with just a few seconds left going into halftime. So they scored, I think, on 4 or 5 possessions, just ran up and down the field on Auburn. So, I think that's a big concern if you're Auburn's. I got away from whatever your question was exactly, but I don't know if I answered it or not there. But
no, you did. No, just looking for some of the general trends, that you've seen from this team this year and how they could play into, the game this weekend and some of the keys for them. Yeah.
I don't think they're going to overpower South Carolina or anybody on their schedule other than maybe, they don't play Vanderbilt, but so it's going to have to be a game that's going to be back and forth. They're going to have to make a play on special teams or turn the ball over to really help them win or secure a win. If Auburn's going to do that, I would not be surprised if South Carolina won, to be honest.
Yeah, from what we saw at Vanderbilt, Auburn should make some moves to get them on the schedule this year.
Yes.
Honestly, so about the final thing I got, Bryan, Bo Nix, obviously, I sort of paid attention to him in recruiting just because he and Ryan Helinski were both right up there in the rankings in that same class. Super highly recruited guy, 5-star. What's sort of been, I guess, the trajectory for him? Has he made the strides from last year to this year that are needed, or is it still just sort of a work in progress with Bo?
Well, I have a little contrary opinion on him. I think Bo Nix is a special quarterback. I mean, I really do. I think he's going to play on the next level. I think he's going to be successful. But he hasn't really shown that to a large extent this year. I think partly because the offensive line has struggled. Mm-hmm. And I think you've seen in times, it's not just that he's always getting pressure, which he does a lot, but now he's gotten to the point where he stops trusting the offensive line. So he's feeling pressure sometimes, even when it's not there. And that makes it really difficult for him to function as well as he can. And I think you add in a brand new offense and not having spring practice. I still think they're in the process of sort of developing things between him and Chad Morris. in the offense and so I just think it's sort of like a puzzle that just hasn't not been put together yet. It's just got certain parts done. Other parts are just not together yet. And I don't think they're ready to put it all together this week either. I think it's going to be, let's find a few things that we do good and see if it'll work.
That's all I've got for Bryan. I think really appreciate the time, man. Really appreciate the insight on Auburn. Really looking forward to the game this weekend. It should be a good one. It should be a close one.
Yeah, I think so too.
So yeah, so I'm really interested.
Are you guys are y'all traveling, Bryan, or not?
I'm probably not going to travel at all. We do have an intern who travels with the student paper, so he'll be there. And really, the only reason to travel is for pregame, right? To see who shows up.
Yeah.
So I'll be watching here, and I'll probably see some of you guys on Zoom afterwards, maybe in the press conferences. So
awesome, cool, well, good stuff, Bryan. We appreciate it, man.
Oh, I want to say one more thing. Will Muschamp, Bobby Bentley, T-Rob, both have been at Auburn, worked at Auburn. T-Rob played at Auburn. Three of the best coaches I've had a chance to meet personally, and just wanted to send my regards. I know they're not actually watching, but just wanted to say how much I've enjoyed getting to know them in the past. So y'all guys take care, and all South Carolina folks out there, I hope it's a terrific game, and we'll see how it turns out.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we don't know that they're not watching. They should be really bored right now watching. If they are, y'all need to get back to work if you're watching us right now. So yeah, Bryan, good stuff, man. We really appreciate it, and y'all stay safe out there, and hopefully it'll be a good game Saturday. Okay, man.
Look forward to it, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Bryan.
All right, it's Bryan Matthews, auburnsports.com, talking about this big matchup on Saturday. And Chris, interesting for me, like I said before we got him on, we always learn something new, because so basically whenever we have guests on, they're the version of us on the Rivals Network most of the time for whatever team South Carolina is playing, right? So with Auburn, and I even with Chris Lee, as soon as he got off, last week, I was like, man, Carolina's going to kill Vandy. And
yeah,
because it was obvious they had major problems offensively. Well, I'm not going to sit here and say South Carolina's going to kill Auburn, because that's not going to happen.
Right.
This is going to be a fourth quarter football game. This is going to come down to who does something great or who does something dumb, honestly, late in this game, because that's how it works when South Carolina plays Auburn. Weird stuff happens.
Oh.
And as you said earlier this week, Auburn can't help but get into weird games with people. I mean, last week was super weird. But my biggest takeaway, my biggest surprise was just how down, and Bryan being someone who sees this team on a all the time basis, just how down he was on their O-line and D-line. And that's what, I've read that they had issues up front. And we know, one of their studs from last year is starting for the Panthers already. We know the talent they had at Auburn. But the way he talked, man, didn't really, like Cartwright says, it didn't really give you a lot of confidence about this Auburn team.
Yeah, there are several factors. So it's some personnel losses, on both sides of the ball. And the really alarming thing for Auburn, I think, is their play up front. Now, some of it is guys, Big Cat Bryant's been out. They've had to play some young guys on defense. But if you're not playing well on the line of scrimmage or lines of scrimmage, it's going to be difficult to win games, right? They beat Kentucky. And seriously, man, if you go back and look at sort of how that game played out against Kentucky, you look at 29-13. Oh, man, that, took care of business. The difference was, as we talked about, turnover margin. If you win the turnover margin 3-0 and it's fairly evenly matched, you're going to win, probably by multiple scores in almost all cases. And so that's what happened there. You look at Arkansas, as Bryan said, Arkansas was able to go up and down the field offensively some. Narrow victory there. Georgia caused a lot of issues. They're going to cause a lot of people issues. They're going to cause everybody they play issues because they're so fast defensively. But that is another game in which we saw Auburn's offensive line, particularly on the edges, really struggle, right? And then defensively, they haven't been as good as we have seen in the past with Kevin Steele. A lot of that's probably personnel losses and having guys out. Offensively, they're in Chad Morris's first year there. Obviously, he has an offensive system that's proven to work, especially when you got really good players. But one thing we also know from the days with Chad Morris's team, at Clemson playing South Carolina, is South Carolina was able to win those games and have success defensively by, and this isn't, unique to Chad Morris's offense, but they were able to win up front. Clemson's 5, couldn't block, South Carolina's 4. And so we're seeing some of that at Auburn right now, even with really good skill guys and a talented quarterback. If you're not playing well up front, that makes it tough. So huge key in this game to me is line of scrimmage play for the Gamecocks. Win the line of scrimmage, limit explosive plays, and don't lose the turnover margin.
Yeah, and I kind of feel like an idiot right now, Chris, because I always forget one more thing I wanted to ask after they leave. It's kind of like when you were single and you meet a girl and then you forget what you should have said and you remember like 5 minutes later. But I know it's been a long time since you were single, Chris. It's been, I guess, a year and a half since I have been as well. But I wanted to ask what the dynamic has been like between Chad Morris and Gus Malzahn, because you're always going to have questions with Gus about who's actually calling the plays, who's actually designing the game plan for that week, and who's actually completely involved, as far as, what's happening there. And I mean, you've had people leave Auburn to go be offensive coordinators at other places that in theory would really on paper be a step down because they wanted to sort of get out of Gus's shadow. So I don't know, have you read or seen anything about sort of, I mean, it sounds like Chad Morris is calling plays, at least from what they've said publicly, right?
Yes. Every appearance has been that, and for what we've seen and heard, is that Chad is running the show offensively. Now, Gus throwing some ideas in. I'm sure the thing that I think keep in mind there, and it is an interesting dynamic and would have been an interesting question, but, those guys have similar backgrounds, right? Something Will Muschamp mentioned. So offensively, it's not like they're, on different pages, really. Sure, there's some things that, as play callers, maybe they do differently, but Chad is apparently, calling the plays and running the show. So it is a little bit different. And Gus has handled that. You're right. He's handled it differently at Auburn, sometimes letting a guy call it or maybe taking it over like mid-season. We saw that, I think, with Brett Lashley, that situation. So there have been some interesting dynamics at play there.
All right, so if y'all got any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat. I'm sure we missed some along the way. But, Chris, I think the other thing that I'm thinking as far as matchups that just popped out to me was the size of Auburn's linebackers. And I don't even know off the top of my head how big, like Owen Papo. I mean, this kid is a freak athlete. Mm-hmm. And probably one of your best athletes at that position, I would dare say, in the SEC. I mean, I remember hearing when this kid was in high school about just what a freakazoid he was. But it sounds like their linebackers are a little more on the athletic, fast, but not necessarily built for power running. So, I think really for me, that sort of, as the week goes on, you sort of formulate an idea of what's going to happen, what could happen, what should happen. And for me, lack of guys up front defensively for Auburn on the defensive line, plus Carolina, which has sort of started to find an identity with Kevin Harris as the focal point of their running game and in some ways the focal point of the offense, versus some linebackers who are maybe a little more built for speed and playing in space, tells me that if you want to start to sort of dive into matchups, it's going to be when Kevin Harris and these Auburn linebackers meet in the hole about 3 yards down the field.
Yeah.
Who wins those battles, I think.
I would think that that's something that Mike Bobo and this offensive staff, has taken a hard look at in terms of, okay, when you're looking at how to attack this team. Bryan mentioned on the program that, the nickel Christian Tudd has been picked on some. I'm sure they're going to try to exploit some matchups with Nick Muse and Shi Smith, but this team's sort of bread and butter, right, has been running the football. When they've been good offensively, they've been running the ball. They haven't created as many explosive plays passing it, particularly downfield. And so they're going to look at that and say, can we get our big offensive linemen to the second level? And you're right. Zacoby McClain, I think, is 6 foot, about 215. Papo's 6'1", 215, 220, something like that. And so these guys are fast. I mean, watching them play this year some too, against Arkansas, they can fly around. They can cause you some problems in space, but can you get on them and sort of move them out of the way and let Kevin Harris run, Deshaun Fenwick, maybe just Quandre White? Can Kevin Harris, as you said, break some tackles? I think he's going to have the opportunity to do that. He's done that against a lot of good players so far this year.
Yeah, 20. According to Pro Football Focus, I was diving into some of their numbers today. Kevin Harris with 20 sort of forced broken tackles, basically. Forced missed tackles, I believe is how you would say it. So far this year, 16 on runs and I think 4 on receptions, which through 3 games, pretty crazy. You're looking at almost 7 per game. And that's actually, I think, second in the league behind, of course, Najee Harris, who is the only running back right now who is ahead of Kevin Harris in rushing yardage as well. So that gives you a feel. And by the way, we've got an article I just posted. It's actually probably the longest article I've written in a long time on Kevin Harris on our front page right now and how he went from being a guy with no Power 5 offers to having an offer from South Carolina and being the SEC second leading rusher. So would really appreciate it if y'all would go check that out on GamecockCentral.com. Chris, what else do we have as far as any more thoughts that you have on what Bryan had to tell us?
Well, one thought I had, I thought his shout out to the coaching staff was cool. There are a bunch of ties. I was thinking about that after he said the ties that he mentioned Muschamp, T-Rob, and who did he mention? Whoever else. Yeah, Bobby Bentley, obviously, at Auburn. There are more than that, though. I mean, Kyle Krantz was there with Muschamp as an analyst, now special teams coordinator and assistant secondary coach for the Gamecocks. DeMarco McNeil, an analyst at Carolina, actually played at Auburn. Tracy Rocker, I'm sure, has coached at Auburn. No, he really has coached at Auburn. Tracy Rocker has been there. Another analyst or two on South Carolina staff. So a lot of carryover, a lot of ties. So some guys that have familiarity with each other. Muschamp obviously is going to have familiarity with the way that they do things at Auburn, with Kevin Steele, with Chad Morris. He knows those guys, knows how they operate. So I think it's a really compelling matchup, in a lot of ways. And as we've said a bunch of times, expectation is a close game. I feel similar to how we felt going into Tennessee, right? Different teams, like Tennessee's got different strengths than Auburn does, got different weaknesses. But I felt like that one was going to be a close game. And I sort of have that same vibe going into this one.
Dude, it really is kind of weird how many connections there are between these two programs, considering they don't really play each other.
Yeah.
It's not some rivalry. It's not a game that happens all the time, but there are so many connections. Muschamp's been there 3 times. Chad Morris, obviously very familiar with South Carolina from his time in the upstate. So that isn't it. I don't know if that's here nor there as far as how it actually affects the game, but it's still interesting. Like you said, I think compelling is a good way to say it, a good word for it. So we'll see. And we had a question, Chris, that said, I think, will this come down to who is the toughest maybe, or who is the most physical? I can't remember how it was said. I missed it. But I think that's maybe probably one of your top 3 or 4 or 5 things as you go in this game. Who is going to bring it every single play? And I know you could say that. I mean, honestly, when we start breaking down these games, a lot of this stuff you can say about any game. Who runs the football best probably has a better chance of winning the game. That's like a truism in football. But certainly when you look at some of the concerns for Auburn right now on both sides of the ball, you look at some of the strengths of South Carolina. I think who has toughness is probably going to have a really good chance of winning this game because that translates to other keys that people will always point out, which would be third down conversions. Generally, if you can run the football, you're going to be pretty good on third down conversions because A, you're getting in third down in makeable situations, and B, you're converting your third and ones. We talk about red zone and who's going to perform in the red zone is probably going to win the game. Well, guess what? Who runs the football better is probably who's going to have the most success, generally, not always, in the red zone, I think. Well, if you dive even further, for this particular matchup, you have a struggling offensive line for Auburn, a struggling defensive line against a South Carolina, I would say, offense that has also struggled at times to protect the passer for a multitude of reasons. It's not always on the O-line. But Chris has found something in the running game, particularly that match of Bobo and some of his old school concepts and Kevin Harris, who really was sitting here hiding on the South Carolina roster, all 5'10", 225 pounds of pure muscle of him, hiding on the South Carolina roster as possibly the perfect Mike Bobo scheme running back.
Yeah. I mean, certainly his emergence has been gigantic for this team. And, going back to the keys, obviously I said this earlier, trench play is going to be huge, particularly when you look at Auburn and say that might be an area that South Carolina can exploit. But I go back to, third down defense is another one you mentioned. South Carolina's been tremendous there. Even sitting at 1 and 2, Tennessee, I think, was 1 of 11. Florida was 4 of 9. I think they didn't get into as many. And then you had 1 of 12 at Vandy, who didn't do much on offense aside from 1 or 2 drives. But the Tennessee game, if you look at the Tennessee game, you say, man, you held Tennessee to 1 of 11 or whatever it was. You probably won that game, but they didn't. And there were a couple issues there that I think could carry over to Auburn. One's explosive plays. You do look at Auburn. You worry about explosive plays because of Seth Williams at wide receiver, because of Tank Bigsby, his ability to break tackles, and because of a guy like Anthony Schwartz who's lightning fast. You look at that and say, man, South Carolina's lost a few of those matchups from time to time, and in a game in which we think it's going to be close, you can't really afford to let Anthony Schwartz go 75 on you. You can't afford to let Tank Bigsby take a 3rd and 2, and maybe you got him wrapped up and he moves the chains and then they go create an explosive play or sustain a drive. So I think that's the key. And also tempo. If Auburn gets rolling, they're going to use some tempo. We've seen South Carolina have some issues against Tennessee on one of the drives with some of the runs. They got tempoed a little bit. So something that South Carolina's going to have to be aware of, playing in space, winning one-on-one battles. Yeah, the battle in the trenches is certainly up front is going to be key. But when you have opportunities to make those one-on-one plays, make them, win some of those battles, and then don't get out of alignment, don't get out of position, when Auburn goes tempo or shows you some different things.
So final thing I got for you, Chris. I know I haven't watched SEC Inside. I know some of our watchers were commenting about it in the chat. Was there anything, I need to record it and go watch it. Was there anything from SEC Inside worth talking about or worth noting that we didn't know previously?
Well, we got to see some Mike Bobo in the booth, which I thought was cool. I don't know if you guys have gone back. There are a couple productions that I think Georgia's official athletics department did, like the 2011 or 2012 season where Mike Bobo was up in the booth at Georgia, and he was fired up. I think it was the Georgia-Tennessee game, which was a wild game that year. Lots of points on both sides. Georgia won. So it wasn't quite that exciting. It was toned down a little bit, but just to hear Mike Bobo up in the booth, communicating with Will Muschamp. There was a situation where it was where Colin Hill had the short 4th and inches keeper on the goal line and ended up getting it, as soon as I think it was on the first down, when they got into the red zone, you heard Will Muschamp telling Mike Bobo on the headset, hey, you got 4 downs. They had the fake punt that Vanderbilt ran, and I don't know if that was creative editing or it really all did happen, but you heard Derek Mason signing off on the fake punt, and you heard Will Muschamp telling his team to watch for the fake punt, and then Jalen Foster goes and makes the play, Foster and Kevion Mullins, and the aftermath of that. So there were some neat sort of behind-the-scenes moments, so I would definitely recommend everybody check that out.
All right, and also I have here, we're making this up on the fly, but I figured this is cool. Our probably most loyal, some of y'all may disagree, but I would say our most loyal watcher to this point is Gamecock Russ. And Gamecock Russ retweets our tweet about the show pretty much every day. So for today, we're going to have the Gamecock Russ stat of the day. So go to Twitter, follow Russ at RustyB25. This ish is crazy. On December 3rd, 1932, Earl Clary, who is apparently a family member of Ryan and Matt Clary, who some Gamecock fans may know. Ryan, I think, still does radio in the upstate. Matt does eye surgery here in Columbia. Earl Clary ran for 114 yards in a 2020 tie versus Auburn. This is the only time in 12 meetings South Carolina has had a 100-yard rusher against the Tigers. Kevin Harris has run for 100 yards in the last 2 games, and Auburn has not allowed a 100-yard rusher all season. Ooh. So as much as Brian Matthews wants to talk down that Auburn defense and the front, the dudes still have not allowed a 100-yard rusher.
Yeah.
So don't completely buy in to the fact that Auburn just sucks on defense, because there hasn't been a 100-yard rusher yet. And Georgia's backs are pretty good.
Yeah.
So just that's our Russ. And hey, if you follow Russ, because he'll throw some stats at you, man. I'm not a big stat guy. I don't go back and check on him like that. So Russ bringing the heat there with that one, Chris.
That's a nice one. Earl the Pearl Clary, which I just made up. I think I go to church with Ryan Clary's either dad or grandfather I met at one point. So another random fact for you. That's a great point. I did think earlier, I did not realize that stat, so that is an awesome stat. You go back to the Auburn, South Carolina games in 2010 and 2011, and Marcus Lattimore, did not have his best performances in those games. No fault of his own. Those were games that South Carolina didn't do as much on the ground, but the 2011 game, Lattimore was 17 for 66, so just a solid game, but not great. And then the year before, in 2012, that comeback game, Wes, that you mentioned, the Cam Newton comeback game, Lattimore was 14 for 33. Scored a touchdown in each of those games, but an SEC title game I didn't even pull up, so I'm not sure, but I don't remember him having a huge game in that one either. So, yeah, I mean, man, now it'll probably happen, right? 2020, Kevin Harris is going to have like 3,000 yards in the game or something just because. But
Graham said it's going to be Colin Hill that would be the first to get 100-yard.
If that happens.
Graham, if that happens, you got a free year on Gamecock Central. I'll give you $100 value. I'll give you a subscription.
Yeah.
Right off the bat. So, and apparently, what did you say Earl Clary's nickname was? Earl the Pearl, Chris?
Earl the Pearl Clary.
Apparently, his actual nickname was the Galloping Ghost from Gaffney.
Oh, yeah, that's that guy. Yeah, I've heard that nickname. Yep.
So, which is way cooler than Earl the Pearl.
That's a decent nickname. Cartwright, you're right. I was thinking Lattimore got hurt in that Auburn SEC title game. That is the one, right? Yeah. Yeah.
I thought he got hurt in the Chick-fil-A Bowl.
He got hurt in the FSU game, got the mouthpiece knocked out. That's what I was thinking, too. It was an Atlanta game, but I wasn't sure it was the SEC.
He got hurt early in that game. I don't know that he got hurt. Maybe he did. But I remember that. So both of those were 2010.
Yeah.
I remember that the game at Auburn during the regular season, Carolina hit a bunch of big plays in the passing game, but basically could not run the football at all. And it wasn't because of Lattimore. It was just that the line, I feel like, was getting whipped by a really good Auburn front. So
Lattimore in that SEC title game had 16 carries for 84 yards. So I think he was around. But yeah, Cartwright, I think you are thinking of another Atlanta game, which was that Chick-fil-A Bowl, like Wes said. Cam Newton, 17 for 28, 335 yards, 4 touchdowns, and then 14 carries for 73 yards, 2 touchdowns. I remember after that game, the SEC title game, because that was one where South Carolina, they had narrowly lost 35-27 on the Plains. So it's Auburn. Can Spurrier finally get an SEC title for South Carolina? It was really, I remember being there. It was really something. And man, that was a deflation for Gamecock Nation on that one. Cam Newton was an absolute, they would have him like bottled up and he would just whoop and run for 10 yards or whoop, complete a pass.
Yeah, Cam was a freak, man.
Cyborg. Yeah.
Still is. So, all right, y'all. I think that's going to do it for today. We'll be back tomorrow afternoon. If you're joining us late, this will be archived immediately on YouTube. You can go back and watch it from the beginning. Or as soon as I can get it downloaded and then uploaded back to the podcast platforms, it will be on all the major podcast platforms. So, all right, y'all. Enjoyed it. Appreciate all the comments. One of my favorite parts of the show is just watching y'all, the stuff y'all say in the chat. And the arguments y'all have are pretty fun too. But all right, y'all, for Chris, I'm Wes. We'll see you tomorrow.